I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the truth, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff. I'm a Catholic PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto, and I also write as a journalist.
And I'm Matt Bernico. I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois.
This week we're talking with Greg Daly, a journalist at the Irish Catholic, a newspaper based in Ireland, about the Easter Rising. So Greg edited a book in 2016 called 1916, The Church and the Rising, based on a special issue of the newspaper. And you can get that book on Amazon and also on the Irish Catholic's website, so we'll tweet out some links to those. In the book, Greg and other writers call attention to the Catholic faith of the rebels, and in one article, Greg says, the atmosphere of the Rising was drenched in Catholicism, the rosary the soundtrack to rebel activity wherever it took place. So there's some exciting rhetoric to get you pumped.
In addition to just this episode, something kind of cool happened, an alignment of planets or something, where Rev Left Radio just did an episode on the Easter Rising, and so did we. So if you're interested in more of the explicitly socialist themes of the Rising, if you're interested in James Connolly, for example, and you should definitely be interested in James Connolly, go over to Revolutionary Left Radio's podcast and check out their episode on the Easter Rising. It gets into some different parts of the uprising that we don't quite touch on here, so check it out.
Cool. Let's turn it over to Greg. Great. So this week we're talking with Greg Daly, the chief reporter at the Irish Catholic, and we'll get into a lot of really interesting things about the Easter Rising in 1916 in Ireland. But before we do, Greg, maybe you could just sort of introduce yourself and say maybe a little bit about what you've been up to lately at the paper.
Hi. I'm chief reporter with the Irish Catholic. It's the longest established and the best-selling kind of religious newspaper in Ireland. It's been going since the late 19th century. I've been with the paper solidly for about 3 years. I was a columnist occasionally for it before that. So lately we've been focused on various kind of news things, as you would expect. We had a special issue about Padre Pio about 2 weeks ago. And we're rolling into an issue now which will include a piece about the so-called conscription crisis, which happened 100 years ago, and is the bridge between the 1916 Rising, which we'll be talking about, and the War of Independence, which led to independence for most of the country. So that's what we've been up to.
Yeah, that's great. That sounds pretty busy. Anyway, busy few years to be kind of covering a lot of centenary anniversaries of a lot of different historical events, I would imagine.
Yeah, no, very much so. The Rising became, it was kind of almost the centenary of the country, as an independent country in some sense. And we realized this was going to be obviously a big thing. So during my first year on the paper, we kind of talked about doing a special issue dedicated to the centenary. We published it in December 2015, so ahead of time, before everybody was, almost bored with it. And we got that out then. It did incredibly well. And subsequently, we built on that. We enlarged it and we turned it into a book, which we brought out a few months later. So it's, we've been busy working on this, certainly.
Yeah, could you just start off by giving kind of a brief introduction to the Easter Rising? What was it, and who were some of those major figures? And maybe as you were editing the book, what did you sort of feel was really important to communicate about that?
Okay, well, obviously the relationship between Ireland and Britain, and more specifically England, has been, complicated and often unpleasant for much of history. In the 19th century, the start of the 19th century, the two countries were kind of welded into one thing. The so-called Acts of Union in 1800, 1801 merged the two into one country, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And it was very unpopular in Ireland very quickly. But it took a long time for resistance to this to kind of coalesce. And through, in the first half of the 19th century, you had kind of very kind of democratic mainstream resistance to it. The famine knocked that off course when, in the space of 5 years, the country was kind of lost between a quarter and a third of its population. And then pretty much almost nothing happens for about 20 years. There's a rebellion in the late 1860s that fails. And then after that, the country gets solidly onto a democratic course to try and achieve not independence, but autonomy within the UK. And this movement called Home Rule constantly had a majority of support in Ireland. Although over time, there was serious opposition to it from the Protestant majority in the northeast of the country, which suspected that if the country had autonomy, it would become basically a Catholic state and it'd be very unpleasant for them. Eventually, at a point where the British government had agreed to introduce devolution or home rule for Ireland, the response in the northeast is to, hundreds of thousands of people sign a covenant where they will basically threaten to make war if this comes about, and they form their own private army to do this, and they import arms, lots of arms, like 20, 25,000 guns, to do this, to fight to remain part of the UK. The response to that is that you have similar groups form in the rest of the country to kind of pressurize the British into doing this. And the British effectively decide, just as World War I is beginning, okay, we're going to bring this in, but not just yet. And we're going to make a special exception for Northeast Ireland. This leads to quite a lot of disenchantment in Ireland, at least among small groups of the population, and we now know also among the much of the hierarchy in the church, but certainly small groups of the population became very disenchanted by this. In particular, I would point to a guy called Patrick Pearse, who had been a committed home ruler for most of his life, and who switches in the aftermath of this to becoming a hardline Republican, and joins the group of people who are dedicated to taking advantage of Britain's difficulty. The old cliche was England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. And they decided to try and use what was left of this kind of paramilitary force in Ireland to stage a rebellion against Britain. This rebellion has been described as almost like, as a secret cult within a secret group, within a secret organization. It was very, very secretive the way it was all planned. Took place over Easter week in 1916. Didn't go well. They held out for a week, but as you would predict, they lost badly. And the reaction at the time was very mixed. An awful lot of people at the start of it were appalled that this rebellion was happening. Though after a few days, they were at least glad that they'd been able to kind of show their strength, and it didn't show up the country. It wasn't a weak rebellion, People were kind of glad that they were able to withstand Britain for so long. But eventually, the rebels surrendered. They were rounded up. The leaders were all executed, and they were executed kind of in kind of a staggered way that kind of caused a huge amount of national sympathy to build up to this. And a lot of these have been very popular national figures. And the result of all this is that within a few weeks, when the Monthsmind masses are held to commemorate the dead, huge crowds gather at the Monthsmind masses, and it's very clear that there is a huge popular groundswell of opposition to the way Britain had put down the rebellion. And this, building on the disenchantment that was already there, combines in such a way that within a year or so, there is a big swing towards Irish people wanting full independence rather than autonomy. In the 1918 elections, Sinn Féin, which is the party of the day, wins by a landslide and promptly sets up its own parliament in Dublin. And on the same day, the War of Independence breaks out with an attack in rural Ireland on some British policemen there. And the end result of this is that within a couple of years, a truce is called, and the upshot of that is a treaty, but the negotiations, a treaty with the British and what becomes known as the Irish Free State. So it's not fully independent, but it has what one of the leaders at the time called the freedom to achieve freedom. And within 30 years of that, we're a full republic. Although that northeast part of the country, which initially threatened war and pretty much starts the entire military process on this, that's still part of the UK to this day, as known as Northern Ireland. So that's kind of the potted history of 1916.
Yeah, that's helpful to kind of frame the context of the issue we'll be talking about today. Well, on this podcast, we like to talk a lot about the connections between socialism and Christianity and people who kind of exemplify that connection. So in your book, 1916, The Church and the Rising, there's an introduction by Archbishop Diarmuid Martin, who reminds us that the rebels in the 1916 uprising were all people of faith, and that is kind of what sparked our interest in some of this. And in even more that like a number of the priests they played a role in the rising personally. So could you tell us what the faith of the revolutionaries in 1916 looked like?
Yeah, they were, putting it very simply, they were ordinary Catholics. The vast majority of them were ordinary Catholics. Not everybody, of course. I mean, you'll find books nowadays about prominent Protestant rebels, and that they definitely shouldn't be ignored. But overwhelmingly, the people there were ordinary Catholics. And that comes across, I mean, we've always known this about the leaders. Back in the 50s and 60s, an awful lot of the leaders tended to be presented as almost kind of like plaster saints. And some of them in particular have been very devout. But what got very interesting when I was working on the special issue of the paper and then the book was that I went into the state's military archives from this period. And I would read the accounts of the rising as narrated or written down by people who'd taken part in it 20, 30 years earlier. And constantly through this, what you find are these are just ordinary Catholics in a pretty devout time. They make sure to go to confession before the rising. They say the rosary throughout the rebellion. They look for priests to come and tend to them, whether to kind of administer the last rites or to say mass, and to hear their confessions throughout the rising. There's even one confirmation that takes place during it. So people are overwhelmingly Catholic through this. I mean, the nature of the Catholicism varied, of course, and you also get you'll get a few people who are kind of, not just lapsed, but kind of almost anti-Catholic to some degree, or more anti-clerical might be more accurate. Certainly a couple of the leaders were like that. But even then, when it comes to their time in prison and the hours before their execution, it's a real kind of, it's almost like that cliche about there being no atheists in foxholes. Mm-hmm. Even then, they talk to the priests. Even then, they receive the sacraments. And even then, they go to their execution, having made their peace with the church.
Yeah, that was probably one of the things I found the most interesting reading this book. You have all these really inspiring and interesting stories about how Catholicism was present during that really tumultuous week. Could you talk to us a little bit about how, for example, like the sacraments were present as all of this armed struggle was unfolding? What were there any kind of really harrowing stories or examples that kind of stuck with you?
Yeah, there's quite a few. I mean, you have, I suppose the most conspicuous thing is the role of the Capuchin priests during the Rising. Clergy all across Dublin were involved in the Rising one way or another. And you hear of like Passionist priests, for instance, getting a message from a garrison which was in a distillery. And the Passionists are about 2 miles away, and they have to kind of move through the city in the darkness. There's obviously gunfire going on around them, and to come in and to hear the confessions of the men in the middle of the night. And they're kind of receiving letters asking, will you come and say mass for us the next day? And they write back saying that's not going to be practical. But look, you can get a dispensation for it, and make sure you say the rosary at that time. You have the Capuchins, as I mentioned, are everywhere. There's a group of about 4 of them who were buzzing around the city from outpost to outpost. They come out of their friary on Church Street in Dublin, which is very close to one major rebel garrison, but they wind up in other ones as well. And they're requested to hear the confessions of the men, they say mass with them. You hear general absolutions happening on a few occasions. There's one, there's one just before the rising when the troops are all assembled, and it's very much like a First World War army chaplain situation, where the priest in question comes out and absolves the men as a group before they go out to battle. You also have, there's one story about a guy, I think it's Ziggy Calendar, who's one of the rebels at this point, who's a messenger, and his account of moving around the city is kind of remarkable when you map it out, just how much ground he covered and how he uses churches as landmarks. When he tells his story, it's the churches that he constantly refers to when he's moving about. James Joyce's old cliche was about how the real challenge will be to cross through Dublin without passing a pub. Well, whether or not that's true, Icky Calendar shows that you can't do it without passing a church. And he is joined as he's running along at one point over the Liffey by a priest from a church which had been a theatre and is a theatre again now, but at the time was a church. And they run over, they cross the barricades, and then having got into kind of a rebel-occupied zone of the city, the priest promptly does general absolution for the soldiers there in the street. We hear about it happening on the roof of the General Post Office, which was the rebel headquarters. It's everywhere. And as I mentioned, out at it's Boland Mills, I think it is. So it's a flour factory basically at one stage, which was controlling one of the major routes into the city. It's basically controlling the train line in from the main port. So if Britain wanted to get reinforcements in, you bring them through that port and then by train into the city. And at Boland's Mills, which is controlling that train line, there was one individual who he was an Anglican, and he wanted a priest to hear his confession, and he didn't trust the Church of Ireland clergy, and converts and becomes Catholic on the spot. And the Catholic priest who's there, they confirm, and he's received into full communion in his church, and he's confirmed there and then. So you have all kinds of kind of dramatic episodes like that through the whole thing.
Well, on that same part, or that same point about the role of the clergy in some of the struggle, how did the church hierarchy at large react to the rising? Was everyone as supportive as those clergy members, or was there tension amongst the upper ranks?
Not at all. I mean, if you read almost anything on this, you will be told that the hierarchy was opposed to it. The reality is much more mixed than that. In the days after the rising, we know that about 7 of them condemned it. But first of all, when you look at what they say, they nearly always condemn it, but they're usually condemning it because it had been doomed to failure, and they're also condemning it because they kind of feel that the rebels were provoked into it. So even then, it's not an unqualified condemnation. But you've got to bear in mind that there were nearly 30 bishops in the country at the time. So what were the other bishops thinking? And it looks like most of them were holding their counsel. We know that the bulk of them seem to have, by this stage, grown disenchanted with the Home Rule cause. They felt that Home Rule parliamentarians were just in it for themselves, and they felt that the British were not to be trusted, and that the best that was going to come out of Home Rule was going to be devolved government for 2 separate jurisdictions in Ireland, one of which would have a massively Protestant majority, which is, of course, Northern Ireland to this day. So they seem to have kept their own counsel, and with the exception of Edward Dwyer, who is the Bishop of Limerick, and Dwyer is pretty outspoken in favour of the rebels. Now, he dies within a year of it, but nonetheless, he's definitely outspoken on this issue. We know from other accounts written afterwards, and of course, possibly time is colouring this to some degree, but that there were differences among the hierarchy, both about the Rising and the subsequent War of Independence. And very broadly speaking, it seems to have been that older bishops who were long-time home rulers were more opposed to the Rising than the younger bishops. In other words, there's a generational shift, and you see it with the clergy as well. You see it with seminarians. Apparently, all the seminarians in Maynooth, the National Seminary, were hugely in favour of the Rising. So there was, basically you're having a generational shift anyway. And this is reflected in the church every bit as much as it's reflected in broader society.
One thing that I thought was interesting was the role of women that you talk about in a section in the book. What was the role of women during the Rising, and why was their inclusion important as part of the Rising?
Yeah, well, I mean, probably the first thing I should say here is the one regret I've got with the book is that I don't say enough on this. I say as much as I could, given what I could find out at the time. I had difficulty when putting together the original paper and the book in talking to women religious orders. And I've since, so therefore there's nothing about the role of nuns or sisters in the book. And I've since found out about things like sisters who were in a convent overlooking one of the main battlegrounds of the Rising and who wrote down everything that happened at the time and stuff like that. So I've learned quite a bit about them since. But in the Rising itself, yeah, women played a key role. Women in the Rising tended to be in two groups. Some of them were in the Irish Citizens' Army, which we'll get to separately, I guess. And many were in what was called Cumann na Món, which was basically the women's auxiliary wing of the nationalist, the Irish Volunteer Force. That's effectively what they were. They had varying roles in the Rising. Women did. The most important one, the one that everybody in Ireland can name, is Countess Constance Markievicz, an Irish aristocrat, Protestant aristocrat, who'd married a Polish count, and she was one of the leaders of the Citizens' Army, the kind of the socialist unit that was there. She actually converts pretty much immediately after the Rising and becomes Catholic. But so she's, out there commanding troops in the field, if you like. You get others. There's a lady called Margaret Skinner, a Scottish woman of Irish family, who is, she's basically a sharpshooter during it. And she's also the only woman to be seriously injured in the Rising. Quite a few of them were messengers who would have been doing the very dangerous work of running or cycling about the city, passing messages from rebel outpost to rebel outpost. You're dealing with kind of Dublin being occupied and about 8 or 9 points being seriously controlled by the rebels. And you've got women moving between them, which of course would have been a very, very dangerous job. The bulk of them were working as nurses or in the kitchens. Now, it's very easy to disregard this, and it's incredibly wrong to do so. Back until quite recently, this role tended to be kind of ignored altogether. Basically, we valorized the combat roles, which meant you ignored the people who weren't fighting. Nowadays, what's happening, and I think it's a mistake as well, is that people talk about them as though they fought in the Rising. They usually didn't. But we all know the cliche about how an army marches on its stomach. I don't think the Rising would have lasted a week. I think it might have only lasted 1 or 2 days if it hadn't been for the role of women in it. You hear, for instance, at the forecourts, one of the rebel outposts, that when the women units arrived, at first the men didn't know what to do with them. And then the women pointed out the men had no supplies. They had tea. That was all they had, was tea. They weren't going to hold out for, more than a day or two with simply on cups of tea. That wasn't going to work. So they kind of took over the food supply system and established a logistical arrangement, where they were kind of bringing in food, whether by kind of either basically looting shops nearby or whatever it would have been, but bringing in food so they could feed the troops. And you hear about this at other outposts where, they would requisition, some farmer would be going by. Dublin was kind of, although it was a city, it kind of touched onto farmland at lots of points. And a farmer going by with 3 cows, or 2 or 3 cows, and they requisitioned the calves immediately. One of the soldiers who was there was an 18-year-old butcher. So they have him do the chopping up, and then they're able to feed people with them. They're requisitioning kind of wagon loads of cabbages or whatever it might be. And it's quite remarkable when you go through the accounts, the extent to which basically women made this happen by feeding the men who were in the front lines. And they played an absolutely indispensable part in the whole thing.
Yeah, that is remarkable, actually. It's a shame that they're left out of the story sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, again, we are recovering them nowadays, which is good, but I think we're probably recovering them in a slightly false way. We're making out, so in the past where they glamorized combat roles and they ignored women because they rarely had combat roles. Nowadays, we're still glamorizing combat roles and we're talking about the women as if they had combat roles.
I see.
And that's not correct either. The reality is they were doing something else that was far more constructive, really, in many ways, but less exciting at some level. And therefore it gets played down, whereas it's utterly vital to the whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Huh. Well, a few minutes ago you did mention like a socialist fighting unit, and while the Rising wasn't explicitly socialist, there were many socialists involved and trade unionists and other workers. Could you talk a little bit about the connection between socialism and the Easter Rising?
Yeah, so in the decades prior to the Rising, the 2 decades or so prior to it, an awful lot of shifts in Ireland, and there have been like major social shifts in general. But one of the things that happens is that in Dublin itself, urban workers start to to unionize. There's 2 key figures in this, both from Britain, both of Irish family. A guy from Liverpool called Jim Larkin, and a guy from Glasgow in Scotland called James Connolly. And in 1913, there's kind of a Dublin-wide strike, which involved lots of workers being barred from their place of work because they have unionized. And it runs for months, the so-called 1913 lockout. During this period, and it's against the backdrop of that, the Unionist army having formed in what's now Northern Ireland, during that period, a similar paramilitary group is established in Dublin, the so-called the Irish Citizens Army, and set up to protect workers, to protect them from basically from police brutality, is essentially what it came down to. So you had this kind of small army in Dublin, led by James Connolly. As World War I progressed, the group is still present in Dublin. A lot of those people who would have been in it originally have gone off to fight in World War I because you get an actual wage and are able to send it home to your family. But the Citizens Army still existed. And Connolly, who's a kind of an interesting figure in many ways, but Connolly is one of the people who pushes strongly for a rebellion against Britain. He makes it known to the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, that if they're not going to rebel, he is. So they basically do a deal and they agree that they will fight together. So in the Rising, you have, and the numbers who took part are not clear, but let's say there's roughly 1,500 men fighting in it. Plus women. 200 of those roughly 200 would have been members of the Citizens Army. So you've got this group set up to protect ordinary workers. Now, Connolly, it's worth pointing out, Connolly he'd traveled quite widely. He lived in America for a while, and he fell out with the US, the Socialist Labour Party originally, because they were unhappy with the fact that he felt that Catholicism and socialism could be compatible. He believed they could be. And it may just have been that he was being pragmatic, that he knew Ireland was an overwhelmingly Catholic country and socialism wasn't going to get anywhere unless it could make some kind of compromise or compatibility with Catholicism. So he'd fallen out with them, but he believed you could definitely blend the two to some degree. And it is significant that these troops who could be seen as simply as socialists actually tended to be Catholic as well. We know, for instance, I mentioned Countess Markievicz earlier. Markievicz converted over the course of the Rising, and it seems that the key moment that convinced her was watching the Citizens' Army troops all getting down on their knees and praying their rosaries. And in particular, Commandant Joseph Mallon, who was the second in command of the Citizens' Army. Mallon had been a former soldier. He'd been in the British Army, and was clearly a very devout Catholic. He's one of the ones about whom we have no doubt, and also must have been a committed socialist to be second in command of the Citizens' Army. And he's an especially timely figure this week. When he was in his prison cell awaiting execution, his wife came to see him, carrying along their 2.5-year-old son. It was his second son, but her toddler, Joseph. And afterwards, Mallon wrote to his wife, like his last words were to his wife. And aside from saying how he didn't hate the British, he forgave them, and he was very clear on this. He felt that they'd been forced into this situation. He also addressed his children specifically, and he says, "Joseph, my little man, be a priest if you can." And he also urged his little daughter Una that she should become a nun. And both of them did. Now, apparently they didn't know about the letter when they went and joined, but Joseph's older brother, Sean, joined the Jesuits. Joseph himself joined the Jesuits. And Una wound up becoming a Loreto nun. And Joseph himself only died last week. He died on Easter Sunday. He was 104 years old, possibly Ireland's oldest priest, stationed in Hong Kong since 1948. So we had that very, very strong link with the leaders of the Rising until this week.
That's so crazy. I mean, it's crazy that this history is so recent in some ways, and also not as maybe publicized. I mean, I hadn't heard about the Easter Rising until pretty recently, I guess, within the last couple of years, kind of researching Christianity and leftism. And doing some research on the Rising this past week, we found also that it was an inspiration for the Bolsheviks, or at least some of them, including Lenin, who obviously would be part of the Russian Revolution a year later in 1917. So we found doing that research that in the Soviet Union, James Connolly was sometimes referred to as the Irish Lenin, which was kind of an interesting connection. And at the same time, the Soviets were sort of nervous about the Catholic dimension of the Rising. So they would refer to it sometimes as the Irish Uprising or the Dublin Uprising to avoid some of these religious tones of calling it the Easter Rising. But what do you think? Is there something that kind of gets lost in attempts to overlook or downplay the Catholic faith at the heart of the Rising? I mean, to have a prominent leader like you were just referring to, write to his children to become, to enter religious life is a pretty profound thing, it seems to me, and a pretty different sort of thing than other kind of revolutionary movements as people often talk about them.
Yeah, I think this is definitely correct. It's worth saying, by the way, I don't know if you'd heard this one, but as far as I know, it's actually the Soviet Union that's the first country in the world to recognize independent Ireland, which is it's a bit odd. During the War of Independence, I think it's because they borrowed money off them, basically. But nonetheless, there is a formal acknowledgement that this Irish Republic that's declared in January 1919, that is off the back of the 1916 Rising, that's an independent country. Obviously, Britain isn't having it, and the US, which is in the middle of the Versailles negotiations, isn't having it either. But the Soviet Union does. The rebels at that point weren't entirely comfortable with this. That's not really the approval that they'd wanted, given the way people were looking at the Soviet Union. But I think it's absolutely true to say that the Rising is fundamentally misunderstood if we overlook or downplay the Catholicism of the rebels. There's a very common narrative nowadays that the Rising was a rising of radicals, and then it was hijacked by the church. That's the prevailing orthodoxy, and you'll read this time and time again. It's not borne out once you start looking at the documents on this one. And you talk to people at the time, and it couldn't have been. The country was overwhelmingly Catholic. Take a look at the census figures and things like that at the time. It was a profoundly Catholic country. It was a Catholicism formed by Victorian England, of course, so it was a curious variant of Catholicism, but it was profoundly Catholic for all that. And as I said, there were radicals in it. The socialists were an element, without a doubt, an important element, but even then they were decidedly Irish Catholic socialists. They weren't, they were quite a particular variant of it. I don't have the figures offhand on this one, but after doing the book, one of the things I did was I went through the military bureau archives again to do a particular search for how often terms came up, because I was very curious about the fact that because Ireland nowadays is trying to reinvent itself as a very secular nation and mostly succeeding. But one of the things that's necessary for this is to kind of pretend that the 1916 Rising was a secular affair. And the 1916 proclamation, the proclamation of the Republic, is held up as this kind of, secular charter, really, which it most certainly wasn't. But nonetheless, it gets held up in that way. And I thought, well, how often did people talk about it at the time? And I did a search through all these archives for how often the word proclamation comes up. And it turns out it comes up maybe, obviously don't quote me on air, but you know what I mean? Something like 200 times. But when you look at the references, most of those aren't referring to the proclamation. They're referring to local officers. A colonel issued a proclamation saying. So it's well under 100 times that it's referred to in thousands of documents. Whereas if you do a search for words like rosary or communion or confession, they crop up time and time and time and time again. I was able to do a map of Dublin showing how often these words popped up in different places. And it's quite clear that these people were profoundly religious. Their life was defined by their religion in many respects. That's not all to say that they were extremely holy or anything like that. It's just, that's the world they lived in. And we falsify that world if we present it as being something else. It's not an accident that, the proclamation begins by saying, Irish men and Irish women in the name of God and the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood. The whole thing, the independence movement is decreed in the name of God. It's not a French republic. It's not like what the rebels of 1798 in Ireland tried to do. It's a Catholic republic is what they have in mind. When they start off by listing, further into the document, they list the rights that citizens are to be guaranteed in this republic. And the very first right that's guaranteed is religious liberty. That comes ahead of civil liberty, comes ahead of everything else. And that's coming off the back of the fact that for hundreds of years, Catholics didn't have religious liberty in Ireland. And this was very much in the minds of the people who were fighting. We have a few diaries and things like that from people at the time who sitting up on rooftops with their rifles while thinking about Cromwell or the penal laws, and times when priests had to hide, when masses were said at rocks in fields, stuff like that, when Catholics weren't allowed to sit in Britain's Parliament until 1829. So all of that kind of fed into it, and that was the backdrop against which the rising took place. People would talk about, and again, the military archives are the most extraordinary documents. People talk about having had their nationalism and the rebelliousness formed by their Catholic educations. People saying it was the Christian Brothers who made a rebel of me. It was the Presentation Sisters who made a rebel of me. It was that kind of thing. Everybody was formed this. I wouldn't go so far as to say, as one distinguished Irish historian said at one stage, that it was a Catholic jihad. It certainly wasn't that, but it definitely formed it. And we misrepresent the entire rising if we pretend otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting distinction. And one, it seems important to me that that distinction is made again and reinforced. Something you said at the very beginning of our conversation that I really thought was important, and it seems even more important now, is that these the folks involved in the rising were just ordinary Catholics. I like that that distinction of them being ordinary in the sense that they aren't deviating from Catholicism. They aren't especially Catholic or something like that. They're just regular folks that are formed in their sort of religious tradition, and that's kind of where some of this is coming from. So just that they're ordinarily Catholic, that they're nothing special, I guess, is a worthwhile point to make.
Yeah, obviously, as you'd expect, you pick any 100 Catholics out of the pews, and people are going to vary in terms of, some of them will just go along on Sunday because that's what you do. Some of them will be members of, sodalities and fraternities and religious order. They will you'll get a wide range, but it's simply, this is just what you do. And I mean, one thing I'm trying to find out is that one of the guys, I'm very curious about this one, Sean Houston. Now, Sean's brother was a Dominican. And we know that when Sean was, and I think his sister was a Dominican nun. And we know that when Sean was in his prison cell, he was visited. Sean was very young. He was only early 20s. He was visited by his brother and his brother's student master, who subsequently became Master General of the Dominicans around the world, and a cardinal who was one of the most conservative cardinals in Vatican II. So it's kind of weird how these things join up, that you had, one of the council fathers was played this kind of minor kind of footnote role in the 1916 Rising. But certainly, so Sean Houston's brother came along with his student master, and the brother asked if Sean could be buried in the Dominican habit, which leaves me wondering if he was a lay Dominican. It would have been a very weird request to make otherwise. No, I mean, this wasn't even an option. I mean, what the student master said was, if we'd known in advance, we could have arranged it, which again suggests that it could have happened. But no, I mean, it didn't happen. He was taken out, he was shot, and then he was dumped in a pit and had lime poured on him, quicklime poured on him to dissolve the body. All the leaders were dealt with that way in order to prevent their grave becoming a relic of Irish nationalism, a holy spot that people would gather around. But no, so you get that. But I mean, it's I don't know. Probably my favorite detail in terms of like the ordinariness of it is the night. It's not actually the night before the Rising. The night before the Rising, everybody goes to confession. The reason being, the Rising was meant to happen on Easter Sunday, and due to confusion and countermanding orders and new orders, it happened on Easter Monday instead. But so on Holy Saturday, everybody goes to confession. And in numbers that were freakishly large, it constantly appears in the accounts that, people are going in bigger numbers than you would expect, even though it's Easter. It's just huge crowds are showing up. But my favorite one is that there's one guy who is, they're trying to gather up weapons for the following day. They're pretty sure something's going to happen. And one guy goes into a shop looking to buy a bayonet. And the guy in the shop says, we don't have any bayonets. I do have a samurai sword. And he goes, oh, that'll do. And so he buys this Japanese sword. I presume it's not a full katana, but he buys some kind of Japanese sword and tucks it away under his coat, and then heads off down to Whitefriar Street, where the Carmelites are and where the bones of St. Valentine are. And he goes in there and he goes to confession and to mass with the samurai sword tucked in his coat. You get some very, very strange stuff happening.
Yeah, definitely. Well, a few moments ago, too, you said that the Jesuits were sort of key in making people rebels and forming their nationalism. So nationalism always has some kind of role in uprisings like this. But what that role actually is a little bit contentious from instance to instance. So what did nationalism mean for the Irish rebels in the Easter Rising, and how was it received among the people involved? Did nationalism mean for rebels? I guess what did nationalism mean for rebels, and what did it mean for the other people involved, like maybe the British or whoever?
In some ways, this is a huge question, and at times, I think nationalism is almost like Brian Aldiss's definition of science fiction, which is it's what you point at and say that's science fiction. People did understand it differently. I think it's fair to say that different people had different nationalist outlooks to begin with. And so not so much the Jesuits, by the way. The Christian Brothers would have been the key ones who had formed nationalist kind of outlooks in Ireland. Jesuits were teaching in a smaller number of kind of pretty wealthy schools really at that point. But yeah, people have been formed by it. It was largely about freedom from foreign rule. And as I say, Ireland had been under, to some degree or other, of English rule since 1171, really. 1168 is when you first have these kind of kind of half Norman, half English, half Norman, half Welsh adventurers being invited into the country. The English king gets worried about it. He makes sure that they all swear loyalty to him. And then it becomes an expansion of English power in Ireland. And you have kind of deliberate exercise in colonialism. You have plantations where you have people removed from land and English people settled there. And this carried on for many centuries, one way or another. And by the 17th century, you know, it's solidly under British rule, really. There's still rebellions, still people trying for Ireland to be its own place. But it's continually under British rule, and often with kind of a pro-British aristocratic ruling class as well that is kind of brought in. Britain, of course, never ever saw itself as being nationalistic. That's part of the British outlook, that they're not nationalists, and that nationalism is a thing that happens to small people, whether they're Irish or Welsh or Scottish or Kenyan or Indian or whatever it might be. You know, nationalism is for other people. Britain doesn't experience nationalism, whereas to anybody watching from outside, British nationalism is a very clear phenomenon, and part of it is defined by believing it's not nationalist. But yeah, I mean, there are different varieties of it. I think it's probably very interesting that one of the I think it's worth looking at two junior officers in 1916 in this regard. One of them is Michael Collins. Michael Collins, who served in the GPO, the rebel headquarters, in 1916, who winds up becoming head of intelligence in the War of Independence. He's the first finance minister, and kind of basically, for a lot of people, see him as the father of kind of independent Ireland. He's not executed as a junior officer in 1916, and then rises to prominence, leads the treaty negotiations with the British, and then is killed. He's basically assassinated during an ambush in the subsequent civil war that took place in Ireland. So he dies in his early 30s. Collins had been influenced, of all people, very strange, by G.K. Chesterton, the English writer. One of the rebel leaders in 1916, Joseph Mary Plunkett. Plunkett seemingly gave or loaned Collins his copy of The Man Who Was Thursday, which gives Collins the idea of fighting a war by hiding in the open. But perhaps more importantly, Collins's favourite book is Chesterton's Napoleon of Notting Hill. And it's said, I haven't been able to kind of establish how clearly this is attested to, but it's certainly attested to in a couple of biographies, that during the treaty talks with the British after the War of Independence, Lloyd George gives every member of his British negotiation team a copy of the copy of the Napoleon of Notting Hill, saying, you're going to need to read and understand this if you're going to understand who you're dealing with. And in the Napoleon of Notting Hill, you get two different visions of nationalism. One being the nationalism of small places that simply wants to be free. And the other is the nationalism of big places, which wants to impose your will on others. And it looks very clearly like the rebels of 1916 wanted the former, that they were looking simply to be free of British rule, simply to have their own government and their own opportunity of making their own rules and making their own mistakes. I think it's significant that Patrick Pearse, who I began by mentioning, Pearse had been a home ruler all his life. And the reason why he wanted Irish autonomy, the reason why he wanted Ireland to be able to rule itself, was mainly because he felt the education system in the country, the British education system, was soul destroying. And he wanted a chance for it to be what he saw as an authentically Irish education system that would free people and enable them to develop themselves properly. So he wanted Irish freedom to the end of Irish education. That's what he had in mind. He only becomes a Republican because he doesn't believe they're going to get autonomy. Now, for what it's worth, I think he probably would be very unimpressed with our current education system. But nonetheless, he had wanted that. The other person I would point to, as well as Collins, and I think this is very interesting, is Sean Lemass. Sean Lemass, again, was another junior officer in 1916. And unlike basically everybody I've mentioned so far, he lives for a long time. It's one of the conspicuous things about our kind of founding rebellion that all of our people get killed. very quickly. You know, the 1916 leaders are all executed. People die in the War of Independence, and people who don't die in the War of Independence die in the Civil War that comes afterwards. So it's not like you, where you have, you know, Washington last, but people like, you know, Adams and Jefferson just last forever. You know, I mean, Hamilton is kind of the freak by dying young. You know, all of ours die young. Lemass is curious. Lemass is a young soldier in the GPO in 1916. He fights in the War of Independence. He's against the treaty. He's on the anti-treaty side. He feels it's too much of a compromise in the Civil War. And he eventually goes on in the 50s and 60s to become Ireland's Taoiseach, our head of our government. And a lot of people regard Lemass as probably the best Taoiseach we ever had. Really strikingly, Lemass is the person who pushes hardest for Ireland to join the early EEC, what becomes the EU. And he believes in this very strongly. And he actually says this in public speeches at the time that went down very well. He said that we should be prepared for this to become some form of a federalized Europe down the line, and we should be willing to fight to defend it. We should be willing to take part in NATO, whatever it would take in order to protect it. Lemass, in other words, doesn't see any contradiction between Ireland as an independent nation and Ireland as a confederation with other nations working together. The key thing is that you're not having, that would be a voluntary arrangement, and it would be an arrangement where Ireland would be sitting as an equal around a table with other countries, sitting there talking to Germany, to France, to Belgium, to Holland, and indeed to Britain as an equal. And that was utterly central, that we could take our place among the nations of the world.
Yeah, it's good that we're already kind of starting to see how the Easter Rising starts to inform the rest of Irish politics for the 20th century and beyond. Maybe we could talk a little bit more about that. How does the 1916 Rising fit into these larger trends of modern revolt in Ireland? And maybe, I guess, related to that, how do Catholics today and during that period of revolt, how did Catholics sort of see the Rising, and maybe today, how do they kind of think about that legacy?
Yeah, those are really great questions. The first bit of it is kind of a curious one. You know, for most of Irish history, modern Irish history, the Rising was seen as something that people couldn't criticize. It was the birth myth of the state, really. You know, it's the point that set us on the path. Even though it failed, its failure was a triumphant failure that set us onto the path to independence. That gets seriously called into question around 1966 onwards. The late 60s see the beginning of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, which is responded to aggressively by the local authorities there. That leads to kind of anti-Catholic pogroms and so forth. The British troops get sent in, and then the IRA, which had been pretty ineffective until that point, people used to say it stood for I ran away, it becomes very aggressive and becomes a full-on and murderous terrorist outfit up there. This poses a real problem for people in the rest of Ireland in particular, as nationalism becomes a dirty word and 1916 becomes a dirty word, because when you get down to it, there was no democratic mandate for 1916. People didn't vote for this, and it was led by a minority within a minority within a minority. You know, there was no mandate for it whatsoever. So the question for many people was, how on earth can you celebrate 1916 without implicitly giving some kind of imprimatur to the actions of the IRA in Northern Ireland and in Britain? And there was never a good answer for this. So one of the things that happened is that we stopped celebrating it and we stopped commemorating it. And for about 30 years, nobody talks about it. I mean, I was in school when the 75th anniversary of 1916 took place. It wasn't even talked about. I have no recollection of it being mentioned at all. The state was very, very, very quiet about it. And we only start to talk about it in a remotely positive way again once the peace process begins in Northern Ireland in the 1990s. Because as the IRA start laying down their weapons, as the Unionist terrorists start laying down their weapons too, this leads to kind of a useful détente, a kind of constructiveness in conversation, and also a willingness to kind of have a bit of a synthesis in how we look at our past as we go from having glamorized it to having hidden it to, well, let's look at it honestly and talk about it honestly. And over the last 15 to 20 years, there's been a real shift in that. And I think pretty much everybody was impressed with how, when we celebrated the centenary in 2016, people were willing to look at look at it warts and all. That didn't mean just looking at the warts. It meant looking at what was good about it too. So it's genuinely been looked at in a positive light. People don't deny the fact that, innocent people died in it. Lots of civilians were killed in it. Some were killed in crossfires. I mean, some were not. I mean, we're not entirely sure. You have different claims of who was the first person killed in it. But it seems like the first person killed in the Rising was either a small child, like a 2-year-old, who was caught in a crossfire just outside the Capuchin Priory, actually. Or else it was an unarmed policeman who was shot when he wouldn't let rebels into Dublin Castle, which was the centre of British administration. So either it was a murder of an unarmed policeman, or it was the accidental killing of a small child. Neither of this is a good thing, and that is fully acknowledged now. People do talk about that. At the same time, people are willing to talk about the circumstances that led to this, that it didn't come out of nowhere. And yeah, like it or not, it's the birth of the state. It's the birth of what becomes independent Ireland, and people will talk about this. But as we've said, you have this strange phenomenon of the Catholicism of it being played down, or played up in very, very weird ways. I was very struck when we had our referendum on same-sex marriage a couple of years ago. And again, regardless of where people stood on this, it was very strange that the head of basically the policeman's trade union, for want of a better phrase, he talked about this and he said, voting for this would be a realization of what the leaders of 1916 were fighting for. And at the time I thought, look here, regardless of what you think about the issues here, I think it is highly unlikely that a group of bog standard Catholics 100 years ago thought same-sex marriage would be the thing that they were out there fighting and dying for. But it does show the extent to which people are willing to latch on to 1916. It's one of the great cliches, is this what the men of 1916 died for? Is this and nowadays, is this what the men and women of 1916 fought for? Have we lived up to their example? And that still does get discussed to this day.
Well, maybe on a similar note then, what do you wish that Christians and Catholics, either in Ireland or elsewhere in the world, knew about the Rising? And what do you wish people who sympathize with the Rising knew about Christianity?
The latter one, certainly. I think, I wish people knew that there was a Christian element to it. I get very, very uneasy about the kind of the greenwashing of that, where it's painted out as a purely nationalist exercise. The fact is that it did come out of the Catholic background of the people involved. I think it's important that people understand that the fact that Ireland is divided today is not a result of the Rising. I keep hearing that nowadays. I keep hearing it from people who should know better, intelligent and informed historians saying this. And yet we know that this isn't the case. We know that in 1914, the British had already put in place tentative plans for the division of Ireland into 2 separate devolved districts in terms of what we've got now. So Irish partition predated the Rising. The Rising isn't a reaction to it. So I think that's very important. The country isn't split because Ireland fought for its independence. The country is split because an element in the country was willing to go to war rather than have any measure of Irish independence, rather than living in a country where Catholics would be a majority. And we're still bearing the scars of that today. And I really, really wish that were understood. I think it's good that people are understanding the texture of the Rising. I think that is very useful, that it's not a simplistic thing. It's not a straightforward story. But at the same time, I think it would be good if people understood that part of that texture is its religious nature. And to deny that is to falsify it. The national broadcaster in Ireland, RTE, made a drama series about it in 2016. That was terrible. I mean, it got worse with each episode, basically. But I gave up after episode 3. It carried on to episode 5. But they did feature religion in it in certain ways. But they did things like they made it seem really weird. So if it was the rosary, it was all shot and lit in a really peculiar way. And it made it seem like a weird cult. Or you have this extraordinary conversation where one of the priests is talking to the Archbishop of Dublin in a church somewhere, and the Archbishop of Dublin is giving him instructions to make sure that the riches of the church are protected. That's the priority. And this is the complete opposite of what was going on. Leaving aside the fact that the Archbishop at the time was wrapped head to toe, basically mummified in bandages because of a dreadful skin condition he developed, and he couldn't leave his living room. But he barely managed to get down from his bedroom at the time. But they were, they were very much insistent on people being helped during the Rising. That was the absolute priority. And yet the show just went for this anachronistic and false cliche, really, of a church that was purely about wealth. And yet we know that the nuns were looking after things, the priests were out administering to people. And it wasn't just the Capuchins, although they were absolute heroes of the whole process. It was across the board. This was and not just the institutional church, it was ordinary people who were ordinary Catholics doing ordinary Catholic stuff during the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really good note for us to kind of end on, just really emphasizing the ordinary Catholic nature of the Rising. And I just want to say the book is really well done. I mean, the material is fantastic, and the design of it is also really nice. So,
yeah, it's a beautiful book.
I don't know how it really is. I don't know how accessible the book is to buy, but I do know that there's a link to buy it at the Irish Catholic, and I would encourage folks, if you can, to get a hold of that. Yeah, we want to thank you so much, Greg, for spending time with us. It's been great to kind of think about the Easter Rising, right after Easter. So we appreciate you spending this time, and hope that as you cover sort of the next big centenaries, that you keep uncovering more and more of these really kind of important links that seem to get sort of lost.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard here, you should support us on Patreon. That would be really nice of you. You can also find us on Twitter, Facebook, and I don't know. Basically, that's it. That's all the places you could really find us. Oh, and iTunes, too. You can also find us on iTunes. So, yeah, you can support us in all those ways. Also, check out our Facebook page and our Facebook group called the Magnificast Basement. We've got a pretty good community of people going there that are posting lots of interesting links, so check those out and become part of our community. All right, see you next time.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.